It began as a rumor, an impossible thread whispered through the static of World War II's intelligence networks. A restricted codebook, one of the most tightly guarded documents of the Second World War, had surfaced far beyond the perimeter where it was ever meant to exist. The first reports were dismissed as noise, but noise has a way of sharpening when enough people try to ignore it. By the time the alert reached Allied counterintelligence, the question was no longer whether the breach was real. It was how something so heavily protected had traveled into the ruins of a frontline sector no courier was ever assigned to cross. The war was entering its harshest years. Secure communications had become the spine of every operation. Convoys, air raids, resistance movements, even the timing of artillery drift. Codebooks were the holy core of that system. Each booklet, sealed, tracked, and rotated on strict schedules, represented the difference between an army with a voice and an army reduced to blind silence. Losing one was more than a logistical failure. It was a strategic wound. And on this day, somewhere in the mud of a contested region, a wound appeared where no blade had been seen. Just after dawn, scattered pages were spotted on a weathered table inside an improvised command post. They looked harmless. Thin paper, smudged ink, another set of wartime manuals. But the men who handled these items had seen enough deployments to recognize the way certain numbers repeated. Code patterns had a rhythm, a signature. This rhythm did not belong here. No official drop was scheduled for this sector. No courier had filed a path into the area. Someone had carried a classified cryptographic system into a zone where every meter of ground changed hands weekly. And that someone had not lived to tell why. Hours earlier, a motorcycle courier was reported missing along a supply road. His route was simple: deliver encrypted updates, return by dusk. But contact broke mid-transmission. Patrols searched the hedgerows and battered stone walls where ambushes were common. They found tire marks cut short by an explosion crater, a scattered satchel strap, no body. Before the report even reached headquarters, movement orders shifted. A frontline checkpoint received instructions to examine all debris from nearby wreckage. Something more than a courier was missing. Late that evening, a downed aircraft, to this day its allegiance uncertain, was found collapsed against a tree line. Resistance fighters combed the site for maps, radios, the ordinary artifacts of crash forensics. Instead, they uncovered a torn canvas pouch lodged beneath a fuselage wing. Inside was a charred booklet with recognizable alignment grids between the burnt edges. They froze. This was not a pilot's notebook. This was a cipher keybook used to unlock entire communication chains. Its presence made no sense. Couriers carried them only in sealed cases. Pilots almost never transported cryptographic cores unless performing long-range liaison missions. And even then, they were instructed to destroy them before impact. How one had landed intact, inside wreckage not assigned to courier operations, was a break in reality itself. When the document reached Allied intelligence officers, the room fell silent. Their faces told the story long before the paperwork did. Every page was part of a system used for operational broadcasts, weather codes, naval movements, and encrypted requests from resistance networks operating under constant threat of discovery. If the Axis had captured even a portion of this book, the consequences would have been catastrophic. Compromised infiltration routes, exposed double agents, convoy losses measured in burning hulls. The first response was panic-masked as procedure. Decoding rooms launched emergency tests to determine whether any enemy transmissions reflected recent Allied phrases. Analysts scanned message logs for anomalies. A cadence, a timestamp pattern, the faint fingerprints of exploitation. Nothing obvious appeared, which only deepened the mystery. If the enemy had not used the information, why not? And if they had never obtained it, how had the book traveled so far off its intended path? Investigators began interrogating anyone connected to courier chains. Officers, dispatch clerks, checkpoint guards, every individual who might have touched the route in the last 72 hours was questioned under the urgency only wartime intelligence could generate. The pressure was palpable. A single lapse could betray thousands of soldiers. Yet every interrogated witness, from senior courier handlers to inexperienced runners, insisted the chain had been followed precisely. Still, doubt spread like fog. Maps were unrolled across wooden tables as analysts traced the hypothetical path of the missing courier. Roads overlapped, civilian zones crossed military lines, and resistance safe houses dotted the region like silent witnesses. Somewhere along this geometry, something had gone wrong, or something had intervened. At the height of this uncertainty, the investigation took an unexpected turn. A cipher machine technician noted that the page sequence inside the recovered book showed signs of incomplete sorting. The courier had likely been carrying not just a code book, but a transitional version, one intended for future rotations, not current use. That meant the document had come from deep inside secure headquarters. It also meant the courier, or whoever carried it, had accessed materials far above their clearance level. It was no longer a case of a simple loss. It was the shadow of espionage. As headquarters pushed deeper, encrypted logs revealed irregularities hours before the courier vanished. Strange delays in acknowledgement signals, unexplained pauses in routine confirmations. Communication breakdown reports filed during those moments now took on new weight. Something had disrupted the chain from the inside, and the breach had radiated outward. By the time commanders reviewed the sealed evidence container holding the scorched book, the question had shifted from how the document was lost to how someone had engineered a path for it to end up in the last place anyone would ever look. The deeper the inquiry went, the clearer it became that the recovery site itself held clues no one had bothered to see at first. The wrecked aircraft bore markings that didn't correspond to any known Allied or Axis registry. Field mechanics argued over the serial plates until one detail emerged. The metal frame had been partially reassembled. Someone had pieced parts together. Scrap from various downed machines, a hybrid built to resemble a legitimate craft only long enough to serve a purpose. Its final crash site now looked less like an accident and more like a deliberate dead drop disguised as frontline chaos. This revelation transformed the narrative. If the aircraft had been staged, it meant the codebook wasn't lost. It had been placed. And placed in a zone raked daily by artillery fire, where soldiers rarely lingered long enough to search debris thoroughly. The odds of resistance fighters being the first to reach it were vanishingly small. Yet they had. That suggested someone knew their patrol patterns, their search routines, even their timings. Someone had calculated who would find the book. All signs pointed toward an internal breach, but the motive remained elusive. Sabotage? A failed attempt to pass information to the Axis? Or perhaps a counterintelligence maneuver gone wrong? As wartime intelligence pressures mounted, answers were needed before the next code rotation, or risked a global compromise of Allied operations. Inside the encryption facilities, cipher machines chattered relentlessly. Operators fed test strings into the wheels, searching for evidence that the Axis had intercepted or exploited the compromised sequences. Each click and rotation carried the weight of fleets, convoys, air raids. One false alignment could reveal whether an entire theater of war had been silently exposed. Eventually, patterns emerged, but not from enemy transmissions. The anomalies were found in Allied courier bag logs, A series of inspection reports filed days before the courier vanished revealed discrepancies in seal numbers. Bags had been opened and reclosed by someone who understood the system well enough to hide their tracks at first glance, but not well enough to escape a full audit. It was subtle. A mismatched stamp, a fiber out of alignment, a seal slightly too clean for a bag that should have traveled through mud. Investigators traced the tampered bags back to a mid-level logistics officer temporarily assigned to document rotation. He claimed no involvement, but his workstation showed recent access to cipher distribution schedules and replacement protocols. He had clearance to see where codebooks went, but not to handle them directly. A tidy profile for a handler in a larger chain, but rarely the mastermind. During security briefings, senior intelligence staff debated how a highly classified future rotation codebook, one not yet distributed, had ended up outside headquarters in the first place. Possibilities narrowed. The courier may never have carried it. Instead, the saboteur could have placed a decoy booklet into his route satchel moments before departure, ensuring that when the courier vanished, or was made to vanish, the investigators would assume he was responsible. This theory gained traction when forensics on the codebook's binding detected uniform charring not consistent with the aircraft's burn pattern. Whatever had damaged it occurred before the crash, likely to suggest it had survived a transport failure rather than been planted deliberately. Someone wanted investigators to believe the courier had crashed with sensitive material, not that the material had been strategically delivered to a predetermined location. Meanwhile, communication breakdowns across multiple units pointed to a coordinated interference. Reports filed from frontline divisions indicated short bursts of static and sudden silences during the hours surrounding the courier's disappearance. These disruptions were localized, suggesting jamming or deliberate interference to mask movements. The more analysts examined the timeline, the more it resembled a choreographed event rather than an accident. As commanders reviewed the growing mountain of evidence, the final layer of deception became clear. The saboteur's intention was not to transmit Allied secrets to the Axis, but to test Allied counterintelligence response. Someone within the command structure had staged a scenario to probe how quickly headquarters would identify, isolate, and contain a breach. The codebook, though genuine in structure, contained subtle numeric deviations that would have rendered it useless for long-term exploitation. It was a decoy, but one realistic enough to force intelligence teams into full mobilization. This conclusion arrived only after the document was removed from temporary holding and transferred into a vault deep within secure headquarters. Cryptographers studying the interior grids and alignment keys noticed misprints invisible to the naked eye. Irregular column spacings, pagination shifts, repeated offset sequences. These were not random errors. They were intentional disruptions inserted into the structure, a signature of an internal test issued without proper authorization. The officer writing the final summary, hours before the file was sealed, noted that the test had succeeded far too well. It triggered panic, misallocated resources, disrupted communication lines, and generated widespread suspicion among courier divisions. The chain of command fractured under the pressure, revealing vulnerabilities that would have been catastrophic if the Axis had mounted an actual intelligence breach. When the file was declassified decades after World War II, it read like a case study in the razor-thin line between security and paranoia during the global conflict. A codebook discovered in a place it should never have reached had exposed more about Allied internal weaknesses than any enemy operation could have. It showed how intelligence, the invisible currency of the Second World War, was as fragile as the paper it was printed on. And in the final reflection of the archivist who approved its release, a single line captured the legacy of the event. In war, the greatest dangers often arise not from the secrets the enemy steals, but from the shadows we cast upon ourselves while trying to protect them.